Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is video 9 from the Beginner to Chess Master playlist, which is a progressive series of videos. And we're going to have a look at several chess tactics. I'll be providing the definitions of several chess tactics and showing what that looks like on board. The tactics in particular, the terms in particular that we'll be covering here are as follows: fork, pin, skewer, deflection, discovered attack, double check, clearance, interference, and one last one, a rare one, windmill. I'll be sharing about 20 examples of these tactics in action. If you're already familiar with many of the terms I've shared, feel free to treat this as a tactics exercise. But for the most part, with each new puzzle that pops up, I will be really quick to simply show what the solution is. But if you're quick enough, feel free to pause the video and try and figure it out on your own. In each case, it will be white to move. Okay, let's move forward here. Let's get right to it. Tactics. What are tactics in chess? Tactics in chess is a certain type of play characterized by short-term attacks and threats. And the first tactic we're going to have a look at is a fork. A fork in chess is when you move a piece or a pawn and it attacks two or more enemy pieces or pawns. So in this case here, the fork tactic is knight to c7. What's he doing? Attacking two or more pieces. The king is in check. When he moves out of the way, we get the rook. Some might describe this as a knight fork because it's the knight who is attacking two or more pieces. In many of the puzzles that I show, in fact, the great majority of the puzzles I show here, the tactics will result in the win of material, the gain of material. But do know that we are not limited to just that when it comes time for tactics. It can be something much more subtle, like the gain of gaining control of an important square on the board, a critical square on the board. Okay, let's have a look at another fork tactic. Queen c6 in this case, forking both rooks. If this rook moves, you get this one here. And similarly, if he gets out of the way, we get the one in the corner. One last example of a fork. This position, pawn to e5, attacking these two minor pieces, and if this bishop moves, you get the knight. If the knight moves, you get the bishop. So very often this can result in the win of material. It can be quite difficult to deal with a fork, having to meet two threats in just one move. Let's move forward here, looking next at what a pin is in chess. A pin in chess we could define as follows. A pin is when you restrict the movement of a piece such that trying to move it may be either illegal or unwise. In this case here, bishop c4 pins the rook to the king. This rook cannot move legally because the king would be in check. So this is an example of a pin. Most commentators, myself included, describe this as just a pin, and it's just a general, we call it a pin. If you wanted to be a little bit more specific about it, you can describe pins as either absolute or relative. We might want to identify this as an absolute pin because a piece is pinned to the king. It cannot move in this case because it would be illegal. We'll have a look at a relative pin soon enough, but first have a look, let's see, at another absolute pin, pinning the queen to the king in this case. The queen can move, but she is certainly very limited. She cannot move off of this 8th rank because the king would be in check. On queen takes rook, there's bishop takes queen. So that's another example of a pin. In that case, another example of an absolute pin. And one last one. Let's have a look at what's meant by a relative pin. This is quite common. You'll see this in the early stage of a game. A bishop coming out, pinning the knight to the queen in this case. The knight, he can move, but this is an instance where it would be unwise to move the knight. As moving the knight, well, you're going to be dropping a serious amount of material, losing your queen there. So if black is not careful, let's say castles here, this allows a move like pawn to e5. And this is the big issue, just giving you a quick tip here when it comes time for a pin. If one of your pieces is in a pin like this, your quick tip is to simply get out of it as soon as possible because this is the risk you run which is to say having your pinned piece being attacked. And it's unfortunate, but he's attacked, and he's attacked by a pawn. Normally he would like to move, but there's a serious negative consequence of doing that in this case. So try and resolve pins as soon as possible. A better move would have been something like d6, guarding that square. Okay, let's have a look next at a skewer in chess. What is a skewer? A skewer is when you attack a valuable piece, compel it to move to avoid capture, which then exposes a less valuable piece for capture. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's see what it looks like in action. Bishop to c4, attacking a valuable piece, and well, it doesn't get any more valuable than the king in the game. When he moves out of the way, what do we get? A piece of lesser value. We get the rook in this case. This is very similar if we're to go back with our example of a pin. This was the example of a pin, right? All that has changed when we look at skewer is the order. We have now the king here and then the rook. They're very closely related. They're very similar, pins and skewers, and it has to do in many cases with the order of the pieces on a particular file, diagonal, or rank. Again, when the king moves out of the way, we're getting the rook, attacking a piece that's valuable, and when it moves out of the way, you're compelling it to move. In this case, the king was in check. You get the piece right behind it of lesser value. Okay, it doesn't have to always be directed towards a king, as we will see in this example. Rook to b3, attacking the queen. Valuable piece, of course. She wants to get out of the way, and when she does, what's happening? Well, we're able to get that piece that was right behind her. In this case, the rook on b8. And let's have a look at one last example here. Interesting way to finish this one up. Promoting, obtaining a new queen, skewering the king and the queen. The king is in check, and when he moves out of the way, we get the queen. Skewers, these will occur when multiple pieces are on the same file, rank, or diagonal. So you might want to be a little bit cautious about, of course, how you position your pieces in the game. You are maybe a little bit tactically vulnerable if you have pieces lined up like this, if you have your king and your queen on the same file, rank, or diagonal, or your king and rook, etc. So just throwing in some quick tips along the way here. Let's move on to what a deflection is in chess. A deflection is when you chase away a piece from an important square. Now, I know that's a pretty general definition, but we'll see it in action. We'll see what it looks like here. I'll describe it a little more thoroughly than that, but the deflection in this case is bishop takes pawn, deflecting the king away from this important square g8. Well, why is g8 so important? Well, from that square he has an important role, an important defensive duty of watching over the rook, because white is having pressure on this square here. He's ready to take the rook. So the king is deflected away from the rook's defense, and white wins material like so. Deflection typically occurs to pieces that have defensive responsibilities. So in this case, he clearly has a defensive duty of watching over the rook. You might be tactically vulnerable. You might be vulnerable to the tactic of deflection if you have cases like this in your own game, where your opponent could take one of your pieces. You're in a position there to recapture because the king is there as the defensive piece, but is he maybe vulnerable to this tactic of deflection? Can he be chased away from that defensive duty? In this case, he can. Let's have a look at another example of a deflection. There we go. In this case here, we see that we would really like to take the rook. The king is there as the defensive piece. Well, he's vulnerable in this case to the tactic of deflection. He's being now chased away from the defense of the rook, and we could win that piece like so. One last example. This one is just a little bit involved, and by that I mean 2 moves deep of a tactic. We have pressure on this knight. This knight here on f6 is the defending piece. We're going to look to deflect him away from the knight's defense. We can do that with g5. This knight doesn't have to move just yet. The pawn could take, but after we recapture now, it's an unfortunate position. This defensive piece, yet again, is being chased away from the defense of this knight here that has pressure on him. So if the knight moves out of the way, we're getting this guy, and, well, if he doesn't move, he's just going to be captured by the pawn. So let's move on here. Let's have a look at a discovered check. What's a discovered check in chess? Discovered check is when you move a piece or a pawn so that another one of your pieces can attack. So in this case here, this rook here, wherever he moves, it will turn out to be a discovered check. So this rook moves out of the way, and it's this new piece, another piece that is delivering some attack, a check in this case. No matter where this rook goes, he won't be able to attack anything. It'll just be the bishop that's attacking the king, but more often than not, these discovered attacks are really turning into double attacks, as we will see. Having a look at another discovered check, or I should say a double attack in this case. And notice this rook here and bishop, as soon as the bishop moves, now two things are happening. The rook is being attacked and the knight is being attacked. This is an instance of not a discovered check, but rather a discovered attack, or what one might call a double attack. Two pieces are being hit. The bishop is hitting the rook, and the rook is hitting the knight. The rook moves, we get the knight, and if the knight was to move out of the way here, we're getting the rook. So these are quite difficult to deal with. In fact, if you see your opponent have this type of position on board, a more experienced player will recognize that this rook here behind the bishop has a certain potential energy. All it takes is for this bishop to move, and this knight is really in the line of fire. So it's really a good idea to already see this rook as having a direct influence along this d file and get this knight out of the way as soon as possible. Let's have a look at one last example here of a discovered check. Well, in this case, it's not just a discovered check, but rather a double check. And in this particular case, it turns out to be a checkmate. The winning move here in this particular case is knight f5. Double check in chess is when two pieces attack the king simultaneously. And by its nature, a double check involves a discovered check. And in double check, the king must always move. Why is this the case? Well, the knight is attacking the king, the queen is attacking the king. If it was just the knight attacking the king, you could take out the knight, but you have two issues. There's two different pieces. You could only address one of these two attackers, and the king is always having to move in this case. You might want to block the queen check, but the knight is there. You cannot cope with both pieces attacking the king. The king must always try to move, and in this case he cannot. This is the most forcing, we can say, the most forcing move in chess is this double check. The king must always move, and he has no legal moves in this case. All of these squares are covered. So let's have a look now at just a few more terms here. Next one up is clearance. A clearance in chess is when you move one of your pieces out of the way of another, and this will allow one of your pieces to then make use of a certain square, file, rank, or diagonal. So in this case here, it's a little bit more complicated than the previous examples. What we would really like to have happen is to get our queen to this h7 square. If we can envision the queen on this square, that would in fact be checkmate, but the bishop is in our way. Going here is just to check. The king would go to the corner, but we can clear this diagonal in this case. We can move this bishop out of the way, do something that's very dangerous, attacking the queen, and we now have a mate in one threat. If the bishop is taken, that's game over, and if black does something about the mate threat, like taking the knight, well, we're getting the queen. So again, these can occur, clearances occur so that we can be making use of a certain square, file, diagonal, or rank. We just saw an instance of clearing the way along a diagonal. In this position, we could see an instance where we're now clearing the way for what exactly? We're giving up our rook to clear the way to make use of this h1 square. We can now give a check. And then finally, we can get to this square here and deliver checkmate. Two more examples. or I should say two more tactics. This one right here, an interference tactic. An interference is when you disrupt the coordination between enemy pieces. It's usually a very good idea in chess to stay coordinated, to have your pieces protected. In fact, many of these tactics aren't working or won't work in chess because if you are staying coordinated, it's very difficult to win material. But even in cases here where you are well coordinated, such as this one here, the rooks are protecting one another, there's pressure on this rook. However, you're still vulnerable to this interference tactic. In this case, knight to c6, interfering with the coordination between these two rooks and delivering a check in this particular case. If the king is moving, we're getting a full rook. So probably best for black is to take this knight out, and at least take someone out instead of losing a full rook for nothing. One last example of an interference tactic. In this case here, we have the coordination between the rook and the queen. There's pressure on this rook here. How could we interfere with that coordination? Well, there's this move bishop to d5, attacking the rook and cutting off the coordination, interfering with the coordination between the queen and the rook. If the rook moves, now we can safely take this rook, and, well, however you slice it, white's going to be winning material in this case here as well. So one last tactic to have a look at, and then as a close we'll see just a few examples of these tactics in combination with one another. So this is a very rare tactic for sure, this windmill tactic. A windmill tactic is a combination where two pieces work together to deliver an alternating series of checks and discovered checks. So in this case here we have rook takes pawn. This is a check, and when the king moves to the corner, now we can move the rook out of the way, and this is now discovered check. The king must return back, and now we give another check, force the king in the corner, and it's like we always have a free move. Every other move is like a free move with the rook. We're slowly gaining material one by one. The king has to keep going back and forth. Again, alternating these checks with discovered checks, and in each case, white is really killing Team Black at the end of it. What a big turnaround that would be. But again, very rare tactic in chess. Again, a combination where two pieces work together to deliver an alternating series of checks and discovered checks. Now, let's have a look here as a close at just some combinations, some different ways you can see these tactics tied in with one another. In this case, with white being on move here, we have this tactic of deflection. Notice that this knight is a defensive piece. There's pressure on e7. We're looking to deflect this knight away from its defense. Unfortunately, this knight he shouldn't move in this case, because if he does move, there's now this follow-up of a fork, a knight fork, or what we might identify as a royal fork, since it is attacking the king and queen. So in this case, black should do something other than move the knight. Moving the knight is probably the worst move, but unfortunately we have this tactic of a deflection, and if black is not careful, it could turn out to be also a fork with the next move. Two more examples. This one here, we have an example of this first move being a fork, and depending on what black does next, we could hit black with another fork or even a skewer. For example, if queen takes pawn in this case, we play knight here, hitting black with another fork. This is a back-to-back fork example right here. The pawn coming up, hitting two or more pieces, hitting these two pieces, and if the king takes, well, we can now hit black with a skewer. King is attacked, and when he moves out of the way, there goes a piece right behind the king. One last example coming up. Another example here of a position starting out, or a tactical sequence, tactical combination starting out with a fork, attacking the knight and the pawn. It's not a wise decision for black to take here. If he does, well, now this is setting up the tactic of deflection. Notice the tension on this d8 square. The king is the defensive piece in this case. He is vulnerable too. the tactic of deflection. Bishop takes pawn, deflects the king away from defense of the queen, and there goes the queen. So we had a look at several examples here. Again, fork, pin, skewer, deflection, discovered attack, double check, clearance, interference, windmill, very rare one. Hopefully this was helpful to you. We're improving our vocabulary a little bit along the way here, and hopefully these tips that I presented along the way will help you to be a little bit more tactically aware in your own games. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it, and I will catch you in video 10. Take care. Bye.